Good morning and welcome to the virtual conference entitled Menominee Agricultural Practices, Historical Perceptions, and Late Prehistoric Reality. The presentation that I'm going to do is to simply summarize the research that's gone on in the garden bed sites here on the Menominee Reservation, and how it's given impetus to a much broader undertaking. My name is David Overstreet. I'm a consulting archaeologist. I generally work for the Menominee Cultural Museum and the Historic Preservation Office, but also do some work for the College Administration here on the reservation and also the tribal government. I have worked on the reservation doing archaeology on a consistent basis since about 1994, 1995, when this project actually began. What I want to do this morning is to try and give you a brief overview of the historical background, what was going on here in terms of archaeology on the reservation in the late 19th century, change of pace and accelerating investigations in the early decades of the 1900s, and then a long hiatus until the 1990s when archaeology took a very different turn on the reservation. And finally, talk a little bit about some of the ongoing research that others are involved in, primarily focused on securing a better understanding of the raised agricultural fields or garden beds that the Menominee ancestors developed well over 1,000 years ago, and actually brought back to the reservation and applied some of those same methods and techniques following the Treaty of the Wolf River in 1854. Here. Actually, it began with Dr. Walter Hoffman, whose image you see here. After spending several years with the Ojibwa in Minnesota, Dr. Hoffman came to the Menominee Reservation in the late 1890s, supposedly to study the medicine lodge, but he realized there was so little written about the Menominee tribe that he did a full-blown ethnological study published by the Bureau of American Ethnology in 1896. He devoted a couple paragraphs to antiquities on the reservation, most of which was secondhand information provided by the Indian agent, a Mr. Savage, and a doctor who lived in Shawano at the time, who gave him information about some mounds on the reservation. They were never specifically located. This map is a presentation, but this was pretty much the state of archaeology and archaeological knowledge on the reservation at the end of the 19th century. Also, at the end of the 19th century, there was hectic activity on Indian reservations across the country to collect ethnological specimens. Two people who spent a great deal of time on the Menominee Reservation were Samuel Barrett, the director of the Milwaukee Public Museum, whose image you see here on the right hand of your screen, and two gentlemen from the Museum of the American Indian, Lance and Skinner and Amos One-Road, who worked as well collecting specimens for their museum. The third person who played a role here, an important role, was John Valentine Satterley, who was a Menominee constable, but served as an informant and actually worked with Skinner. It's not clear to us how much time Barrett actually spent on the work, but the publication that was put out by the Milwaukee Public Museum didn't occur until 1932. There was a considerable hiatus between the field work done in the 19 teens and 1921. Well, in any event, there was this hiatus because of Skinner's unfortunate death in a traffic accident. So Sam Barrett was left with the difficult problem of writing up this work from Skinner's field notes. By the way, as an aside, I have never been able to find any field notes from either Skinner or Samuel Barrett at the Milwaukee Public Museum or other institutions. Among the sites that they looked at was the Catwatch site, one of the few sites where they actually provided a plan view or a map of the site that was relatively accurate and that we can relocate today. And the reason we can do that is this mound number 3 was actually at the porch of Lewis Catwatch's house, and I'm told they wanted to extend his porch, and so Skinner excavated that mound and several others. A very large village complex, primarily dominated by late woodland ceramics. So the work that Barrett and Skinner published had a number of conclusions that were pretty important. The first one that I want to bring to your attention here is that they said that in no case were there any indications of prolonged residence or a large body of people occupying the area. There's just scant evidence from hearths, potsherds, ships, arrow points, and occasional stone axes. But they did link that kind of dispersed and simple material culture to the Menominee tribe. That particular image of the Menominee from Barrett and Skinner's work, published in 1932, persisted all the way into the 1970s and 80s, and the most glaring opposition to the notion that the Menominee were linked to the prehistoric occupations on the reservation came from Ronald Mason in 1997 in an article published in the Mid-Continental Journal of Archaeology. And essentially, the gist of his argument was that the shell-tempered pottery that was found was brought in by strangers, but they just camped and were seasonal residents, pretty restricted occupations. But the conclusion the tribe was most concerned about was that Mason said, and I quote here, "Perhaps the Menominee were not long tenured in the homeland they claimed. They may instead have been in the vanguard of post-prehistory invaders, anticipating by only a generation or two the course that would be followed by others." And he concluded, notwithstanding the still prevailing consensus that the Menominees emerged into history where generations of the ancestors had lived and died in prehistory, corroborating evidence, as just reviewed, remains sufficiently unimpressive and ambiguous enough to invite questioning. I would submit that that may have been true in 1997, but it certainly doesn't meet with our 2020 perspective. And based on our work here on the reservation and at other places throughout southeastern Wisconsin, is that the Barrett and Skinner characterization of the nature of the late prehistoric habitation sites on the Menominee Reservation didn't really give us a clear picture of that life way. And there's no reason to expect that the methods and techniques of the early 20th century would have answered the questions that we're interested in today. The emphasis then was obviously on the excavation of mounds and the information that could be found in them. So, from the mid to late 19th century, we just had the work of Savage and Titus and a few others that were secondhand reports by Hoffman. Then we had the kind of distorted stuff that was reported by Barrett and Skinner, partly due, I suppose, to the loss of Skinner as a collaborator in the research and Barrett having the sole responsibility to write up and publish the work. And then Ron Mason's 1997 statement, that's the strongest suggestion that the Menominee were recent migrants and arrived only a generation or two. What's a generation or two? 20 years, 40 years, 60 years? I have no idea. And we know that the others that Mason was making reference to were refugees from the Beaver Wars beginning in the early 17th century, including the Ojibwa, Fox, Sauk, Potawatomi, Wendat, Huron, Kickapoo, and perhaps others that were simply evacuating their home territories because of the threat of the Iroquois Wars. The tribe's position was still in 1997 one that said, we have been here for a long, long time. That is what our oral traditions state, and that is what we believe. The post 1995 work, uh, revisiting these mounds and village sites in Shaw and Onontano counties, began as part of litigation that the tribe was involved with. But one of the sites that was a key player was a site found by Menominee Tribal Enterprises foresters that put us in a different direction to look at these late prehistoric sites. So four that I want to discuss here very briefly are the Kidney Mound, and that demonstrates the difference between the way we approach these sites today and the way they were approached in 1919 and 1921. The Five Islands Mound and Village site, one of the sites that was also visited by Skinner and Barrett, perhaps, Joe Dick Road that I mentioned, and the Big Eddy West garden beds. So the Sapashticum site is a site that was reported by Barrett and Skinner based only on this kidney mound, mound number 4. When we started looking more closely at the sites reported by Barrett and Skinner in 2007, we discovered that not only was there a kidney mound, but there was another mound group on a higher terrace that was very likely related, clusters of storage pits, and at least 8 separate areas where we could easily discern raised agricultural fields or garden beds, suggesting this was a much larger and more complicated site than indicated by Barrett and Skinner, who reported a single mound, the kidney mound. Our usual or typical approach to this was once we felt pretty confident about identifying the raised fields, we brushed the understory so we could take a digital image that you see here on the right side of your screen. We also then made a detailed scaled map using a transit and baselines on a site grid so we could make a permanent record of where these locations were, their absolute size, and their current status for future preservation. We also did some work at the Pashtcom site that was outside of the garden beds that we had identified and mapped, and we were curious, based on our shovel probing of this site, about some areas that didn't have garden beds and what other activities might have been going on at those locations. In 2018, this small excavation revealed a feature of thermally altered or so-called fire-cracked rock that was in a very shallow basin or just on a former surface. And amongst this collection of fire-cracked rock that had coherent structure as an assemblage or a feature, but was really not tightly defined. But in and amongst this fire-cracked rock were potsherds, which you see illustrated here on, again, the right side of your screen, all of them representing late woodland or terminal woodland occupation at the Pashtcom. So moving on to Sapashticum, one of the sites that was really intriguing to us that was visited by Barrett and Skinner was the Five Islands site. And excavations were conducted by Barrett and Skinner at several mounds, and they were at least detailed to the point where they drew plan views and kind of stylized profiles of the mounds that you see here on the right side of your screen. And unfortunately, they never mapped the site. There was never a layout of the group. There were 7 mounds supposedly there. We found maybe 4 or possibly 5 mounds in 2007 and again in 2011. And we concluded that Mound A on our map of the site is consistent with what Skinner and Barrett labeled as Mound 1 because of the cross-shaped trench in their original plan view. They never backfilled the excavations, and so Mound A shares some real affinities with Barrett and Skinner's Mound 1. But what we came to realize again was that this was an incredibly large site that covered this entire peninsula with hundreds of storage pits and shovel probing indicated material debris virtually everywhere. And we thought that we saw garden beds at the Five Islands Mountain Village site, but they were nowhere near as defined, well defined as those you saw from the Sepashcum site. So we simply put some arrows on the map that led us to believe what they look like. Returning to the site in 2019, we were able to identify not only the habitation area, this is either a midden or a pit house with a late woodland pot broken on the floor, but we also went back this year and excavated a narrow trench across the profile of the raised agricultural fields to verify that they were, in fact, raised agricultural fields or garden beds, and that has now been done. I might add that Wendy Scullin did some informal sampling here in 2018 and found maize phytoliths in what we thought were raised agricultural fields near that big mound. The Joe Dick Road site is another example of one of these large complex villages. This site was, as I mentioned, located, identified by foresters working for Menominee Tribal Enterprises. The Tribal Historic Preservation Officer, David Greeno, asked me to go out and look at the site. And when I arrived there in 1995 or 94, I guess it was, I was absolutely stunned by what I saw. It was clearly the remnants of a community, a small perennial stream running through this valley, and the terraces of both sides are just uh, full of dimples in the forest floor, so-called storage pits or earth ovens or surface depressions might be the best word. And here you can see what they look like when some of the leaf litter has been removed. Over 300 of these were mapped by a volunteer, a registered surveyor, and his assistant. And included was a small plot of garden beds. Here you see them cleared of the understory and a map presented. We did some limited excavations there in 1995 and returned again to do more extensive work later on. Curiously enough, in 1999, we thought that the map that you first saw were the limits of the Joe Dick Road site. It was big and complex in and of itself. Two large mounds still remain, a small plot of garden beds, hundreds of storage features, and undoubtedly habitation areas. In 2012, we went back to do some more testing and discovered additional garden beds on a higher terrace, well above the first garden beds that you saw. And then the following year, additional raised fields and hundreds of storage pits that extended south of Joe Dick Road, so that the area that you see today is a much more realistic assessment of how large and complex this village site is. So the stratigraphy at the upper garden beds at Joe Dick Road were really, really curious. What you see represented here in this profile is a buried A horizon, that kind of darker line at the very bottom, and then an area in between that Bill Gardner, our soil scientist who describes the profiles, identified it as mixed fill. Now, when we had worked at Archibald Lake, doing some work with the Forest Service, um, and Katie Egan Brewy and Mark Brewy and Dr. DePerno at the Smithsonian, she contacted me and asked about possible wild rice. Was wild rice being grown in these garden beds? And I said, well, absolutely not. These are upland sites that wild rice is an aquatic emergent plant and couldn't grow there. And she said, well, the interesting thing is that there's some kind of wetland grasses in these garden beds. And we didn't know what to think of that, kind of dismissed it. Wendy Scullin tested this mixed fill area in the stratigraphy you see here, and it too had wetland grasses, wetland grass phytoliths. And from that, we concluded that clearly this fill was being brought in and piled on top of the buried A horizon to create some additional elevation. And then a planting surface was formed on top of that. Later, another level of mixed fill was brought in, and a new planting surface was developed that you can see here on this ridge. In other areas of the Joe Dick Road site west garden beds, you can see the buried profiles of gardens that were buried in, again, mixed A and B soil horizon stuff. Why they rebuilt those garden beds, we really don't know. And we don't know what the interval was between that. At Joe Dick Road, the radiocarbon dates range from early 1100s to late 1200 AD. The last site I want to talk to you today about is the Big Eddy West Garden Beds, which is a very large complex of gardens on the east side, I'm sorry, on the west side of the Wolf River, in a sandy, gravelly soil that by any circumstances would be considered poor for agricultural purposes. Interestingly enough, before the raised gardens were created, ditches, small ditches were dug, and in these ditches there's a fair amount of charcoal mixed in, and then the garden beds were built over these ditches. Um, does this represent biochar? We think that's a potential, and we're relying on Michigan State University to help us out with this query. It would be really something to demonstrate that, yes, indeed, beyond any reasonable doubt, Menominee ancestors were using biochar as one of the many tools in their suite of agricultural techniques. Another very interesting element at the Big Eddy West garden beds is the more recent radiocarbon date. On the right side of your screen, the lower profile, you can see this very obvious planting surface bracketed by ditches, and underneath it, this dark line of charcoal. That's what was sampled for our radiocarbon date that ranges between 1514 and 1652 calibrated AD. That's really food for thought. Most would assume that by 1500, agriculture was really not a major subsistence element owing to the Little Ice Age or the Neoboreal. But here's evidence that climate change is being adjusted to by these prehistoric residents who, again, seem to have no difficulty coping with modifications in their habitat. Unfortunately, the only artifact recovered from the three 1x2 test units that are highlighted here was a single shell-tempered potsherd. We don't find the shell-tempered pottery on the reservation uh, before about 900 to 1000 AD. So the shell-tempered pottery is certainly consistent with the late date, but it creates other interpretive difficulties for us. Uh, what we can say and feel very confident about is that there are at least 10 late prehistoric communities of significant size on the Menominee Reservation. Given their association with the garden beds and the extensive storage facilities, these are summer agricultural villages and not transitory campsites. The range of radiocarbon dates is from about AD 800 to AD 1650. They share these commonalities of clusters of conical and tapering linear mounds, surface depressions, raised agricultural fields, and domestic structures. We expect that they would be very similar to the bark lodges that were recorded on the Menominee Reservation in the early 19th century, late 18th century. Uh, we really don't have much in the way of information about the way these large communities were organized in late prehistoric times, but working with the National Park Service and the Menominee Tribal Enterprises and the Historic Preservation Department and Menominee Cultural Museum, we undertook a study of a late historic agricultural village. Knippaway, one of the well-known band leaders in the Menominee tribe, relocated his village in 1871, and that location was recorded by Felix Keesing in 1931. And you can see here on the map the so-called location of Knippway's village here as number 4 at the confluence of the Wolf River and the west branch of the Wolf River. Well, we went out and surveyed this area, recorded all of the houses, mapped all of the remains of the structures. The village was pretty much abandoned before 1907 with the development of the mill and neopit, which really at the time provided the only significant economic opportunities, so that from the various communities on the reservation, people left and went to neopit, some of them living in tents, waiting to be employed at the mill or in forestry, and it has become, of course, a central economic focus on the reservation. So we worked with the foresters and we worked with vintage aerial photographs, and we were able to plot all of the clearings at the time, where the houses were in the 1870s to 1907. And then we collected oral traditions from Mrs. Horton and from Mr. Zacchese, who were able to identify where individual families lived. And then we dumped all of this into a GIS format, thanks to the skills and the good graces of Paul Crocker at Menominee Tribal Enterprises, and came up with a model of Knippway's village. And again, it was really revealing, because Knippway's village was really spread out and covered about 3 square miles. Now, whether or not this represents the same kind of organization of the late prehistoric agricultural communities remains to be examined. But I think it serves as a reasonable model of what these lake communities might have been like and how they organize themselves across the landscape. These are answers that we're obviously still seeking. This collective research has given us a lot of insights, but it's also left us with some really difficult questions to think about, to ponder. I like to characterize it as agroforestry, which is really a new adaptation to northern and southern hardwood forests in the western Lake Michigan basin. So it's something new. And curiously enough, it's very consistent with Menominee ceded territory, which is also very consistent with the distribution of the northern and southern hardwoods. What I simply cannot answer at this point is the introduction of the marrow complex shell-tempered ceramics. The age-old argument: did this stuff diffuse? Was it brought in by new visitors or through trade or some other relationship between groups with disparate material technologies? Or was it simply an independent invention late in the trajectory that was begun in early late woodland times in northeastern Wisconsin and the adjacent territories of Michigan's Upper Peninsula? Community structure and organization, we're going to test with the village model that we established from Knippway at some point in time. I hope that will ultimately done. The other thing that we understand at this point very clearly is that to understand the raised field system really requires a multidisciplinary approach, and people from a wide background of sciences brings their skills and their energy and their enthusiasm to some of these problems. We're working with Dr. Gardner at UW-Madison, Wendy Scullin at Midwest Ethnohorticulture, Jessica Meisel at Michigan State University, Jennifer Picard at UW-Milwaukee, and others like the physics laboratory at the radiocarbon laboratory at Arizona State, and others. So bringing to bear all of these different disciplines to understand how this system evolved over the course of 1,000 years and the way it functioned, even during the Little Ice Age, is a challenging set of questions. But I believe these people are all up to the task. All right, this image gives you some sense of the chronology that we've begun to establish here on the reservation. And I realize there's some areas that we really need to provide additional support, particularly at the early end of the chronology and also towards the contact period, what's going on around 1600, 1650. At the Sepashticum site, which along with the Five Islands site, so far has failed to produce any shell-tempered pottery, is where we anticipate our earliest dates. We've got one radiocarbon date from good context at Sepashticum. That's about 800 AD, and then we'll be running some additional radiocarbon dates from Five Islands this fall, and hopefully we'll strengthen that early era for the development not only of the garden beds, but a very secure relationship to Hines Creek and Point Sawble Collard late wooden pottery styles. We don't see the shell-tempered pottery on the reservation or in other locations prior to about 1000 AD. But at about that time, it becomes relatively well established. And while people have argued about these early dates for shell-tempered pottery, Ronald Mason's work on the Dore Peninsula has produced a number of radiocarbon dates based on food incrustations on marrow complex pottery sherds in the 900 to 1000 AD range. There have also been a number of early dates generated by work carried out by the Mississippi Valley Archaeological Center in the Wisconsin River headwaters area. And there too, there are early dates. And there's also been some early dates produced from sites on the Nicolet Forest based on Mark Bruey's work. Around the 11 to 12 to 1300 period, we've got a pretty substantial chronology established. And that era around 1400 is known both from Marla Buckmaster's work on the Menominee River in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, but also from the Archibald Lake site in the Nicolet National Forest, again, work carried out by Mark Bruey and Katie Egan Bruey. We'll also be running some additional radiocarbon dates from the Big Eddy West site because, again, it's a little bit controversial that by this time, by about 1600, everyone assumed, I think, that raised field agriculture in the western Great Lakes, the upper Great Lakes, had pretty much come to a close associated with the deepest part of the so-called Little Ice Age around 13 to 1500 AD. That doesn't seem to be the case here on the reservation or at some other locations. Same people doing the same annual round of raising corn and other related crops and seasonally exploiting wild rice and fall spawning fish and spring spawning fish and winter hunting camps. So there's a real consistent pattern throughout this era. And to our way of thinking, what really seems to bind all of this together is the continuous use and continued improvement of raised agricultural fields. If we're right, and there's no reason at this point to argue vehemently against this model, it appears as though the Menominee's ancestors established a sustainable lifeway that encompasses a millennium, about 1000 years, which is really quite an incredible achievement.